Ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural lecture of Professor Jonathan Grant, our Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London and our Professor of Public Policy. Along with the many distinguished guests and visitors in the audience tonight, it's a particular pleasure to welcome Jonathan's parents and his wife who are with us this evening. Thank you for putting up with him there. Before coming to King's, Jonathan had a very, very impressive career with RAND Europe, where he finished in March 2014 as Principal Research Fellow. And from 2006 until 2012, he was President of RAND Europe, and prior to that, Director and Associate Director from 2002, where he took RAND from a charity with a trading arm to a community interest company there. He indeed recruited and retained very high-profile councils of advisors, including Michael Portillo and Neil Kinnock. And spanning that range of politicians is one of his great skills there. That was a skill undoubtedly forged by his work from really the 1997 until 2002 at the Wellcome Trust, where he moved again from being a policy analyst to a senior policy analyst to executive assistant to the director to the head of policy there. But what many of you may not realize is that Jonathan actually started his career in 1994 to 1996 in the Intensive Care National Audit and Research Centre there, where he worked as a statistician. And it's that love of counting and ensuring that what counts is counted, which I think really defines Jonathan's career there. His research interests include science and innovation policy and health and biomedicine, higher education policy, evidence-based policy making, population policy. He does this at an international as well as a national level. And in 2011, for example, he led a review of the Greek R&D system for the Minister of Education, and in 2008 was co-principal investigator of the influential report, Medical Research, What's It Worth, that estimated the economic returns from biomedical and health research in the UK. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed articles, reports, and book chapters, and I'll spare his blushes by not listing his H-index, but I'll tell you afterwards over drinks if you want to know. And in 2013, he, Sally Davies, and Mike Catchpole published The Drugs Don't Work, A Global Threat, with Penguin. And in 2014, he, Sally, and two other colleagues published a paper in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine that is very dear to my own heart on women and academic medicine, a review of the evidence on female representation. Now, King's College London has a long tradition of service to society, and our Policy Institute lies at the heart of how we make a difference. When looking for a full-time leader for the Policy Institute a year ago, we found Jonathan, and it took some work to convince him that universities could move at the pace and agility that he was used to. Brackets, I'm still not sure he's convinced that we can. There. Since he's arrived, he's given the Institute 4 key objectives: to create, secure, and maximize the impact of King's research on policy and practice, to understand, translate, and embed policy needs within King's activities, to develop opportunities for client and donor-led policy analysis and consultancy, and to position King's as a leader in setting future policy agendas. Now, Jonathan likes data and evidence, so I can tell you that in the year that he's been here, his institute's headline outputs are 1,000+ followers gained on Twitter since he arrived, and I would encourage you all to make that 1,100 by the end of the evening. 10,000+ minutes of content watched on his YouTube channel. A 50% increase in web traffic over the past 5 months. You'll see a ref impact case study in preparation here. 45 events organized, 5,000 people attended our events, 20 visiting fellows have joined the Policy Institute, 2 million+ of research income, 50+ peer-reviewed publications, and 10 peer-reviewed reports, and 1,000+ people participating in training courses. This is a genuine difference that Jonathan has made both to us within King's and to all of us outside King's. But numbers, as I hope he will admit, don't always tell the full story. Sally has given me permission to describe what she said when she was rung up to give a reference for Jonathan Grant. She said, give him a lot of rope, and then give him some more, and then give him some more yet again there. We are delighted that he's taken all the rope he can, and yet some more. He's made a transformative difference, not only on King's, but also on the impact agenda of the UK, about which we'll hear more today there. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure to invite Professor Jonathan Grant to deliver his inaugural lecture, The Science of Science, Challenges and Opportunities in Measuring Research Impact. Jonathan, your inaugural.
Well, Evelyn, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. And can I also thank all of you for your support and interest in this evening's lecture. What I would like to do is to take you on the intellectual journey that has characterized my career to date and introduce you to the topic of the science of science, a topic that I have found captivating and I hope you will find suitably interesting and intriguing. And what I want to do is to make the case that when you put science under the microscope, when you start to understand what works in science funding and science policy, you really start to turn up some interesting and fundamentally important questions, which I will argue are important to the wealth and well-being of the UK and other post-industrialised countries. Most of my talk, I'm going to focus on the biomedical and health sciences, but I think a number of the observations I make are pertinent to other disciplines, not least that we need a research policy, an evidence-based research policy. And we need to sort of bring the scientific discipline that we do in our day jobs when we're doing research to the way that we conduct research policy and science policy. And what I will do is demonstrate that as you put science under the microscope, you generate data. You generate evidence. And that evidence does two things. It confirms existing theory, it confirms existing policy, confirms existing practice. But importantly, and probably more importantly, it also contests that perceived wisdom. And in contesting what we do today, we can improve the way that we fund science, we can make science more effective and more efficient. And that is important because the science that we fund today, funded largely through either the taxpayer, through the National Institute of Health Research, the Medical Research Council, or in the UK we have a very strong medical research charity sector, the Wellcome Trust, Cancer Research UK. That is a finite resource, and we need to invest that resource in a wise way, and we've got to avoid wasting that finite resource. So that's a summary of what I want to cover. Evelyn didn't say the first line on my CV, which is my PhD. With a degree of circularity, I did my PhD here at King's College. Started in 1992 in the Department of Anatomy and Human Biology. My PhD was on the demographic, genetic, and epidemiological effects of consanguineous marriage. I did not know what that word consanguineous meant until after the interview, when I went to the dictionary, looked it up. It's cousin marriage, for those of you in the same place. This is a picture of the Anatomy Museum here at King's College. It's actually 3 floors above us. Above this great hall, we have the chapel, and above the chapel, we have the Anatomy Museum. And from those days in the early 1990s, I always sort of mused about that sort of architectural hierarchy. You know, why is the Anatomy Museum above the chapel? I think that's worth a lecture in its own right, but I won't go there. This Anatomy Museum was where the PhD students were parked in the Department of Anatomy and Human Biology. It was dark, dingy, dusty. It was a pretty horrible space. There were benches running down the middle where we'd do our work. There were specimens all around the place. It was quite a fun place. I had a desk up on the balcony. It's just off the picture here, but my desk was there. I had this specimen case next door to me, and there was literally a pickled thumb sitting to the right of my desk, which we wittily term Tom. This space turned out to be fundamentally important to me for both sort of personal and professional reasons. Whilst I had Tom on my right, for a period of time, Lucilla, my wife, mother of our two children, Almarina and Noah, was sitting on my left. Lucilla was doing an Erasmus grant from Complutense University at that time, and we met in the Anatomy Museum at King's College London. Professionally, I learnt that I was not an academic. I really did not enjoy my period in the Department of Anatomy. I hope it has changed. It was a horrible place to work. It was full of political intrigue, backstabbing. Nobody had talked to each other. There was no concept of teams. You had to do what your PhD supervisor was saying. If you started talking to another PhD student, worked to another supervisor, not good for your career. So I finished at King's and swore to myself, I'm not going to work in a university. This is not the place for me. And ended up at the Wellcome Trust. I applied for a job at the Wellcome Trust as a policy analyst. If I'm brutally honest, when I made that application, I don't think I knew what the word policy or the word analyst really meant, less known what they meant together. But by chance, I found my vocation in my life. And that vocation is bringing research, bringing evidence to bear on policy, on decisions. And that's what I've been doing ever since. A few years ago, when I was clearing out some paperwork at home, I came across my job description for the first job I had at the Wellcome Trust back in '97. And you'll see that the first dot point on this job description is to design and conduct studies in the outputs and outcomes of research. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, but I appreciate there's quite a lot of jargon in that. So for those of you who are not on the same page as myself at this time, I want to introduce a bit of language and a bit of theory, and then I'll move on to the main element of my talk. So we often talk about the inputs of research. By inputs, we mean effectively funding coming from the taxpayer through the Medical Research Council, through the National Institute of Health Research, from the charities through donors, with the exception of the Wellcome Trust, which is obviously an endowed charity. But those inputs are not restricted to funding. We also need ideas. You can't do research without ideas, and you need space. You need good quality infrastructure. So a university like King's College, in which we're present today, is a world-leading international university. It's got sort of half a dozen campuses. You walk around any of those campuses, you will come across facilities for undertaking high-quality research. So you mix those ingredients of money, ideas, place, and people, you can start undertaking research. Now, without wishing to drop into caricatures, spotting a biomedical health scientist is relatively easy. They often wear white lab coats. Spotting a social scientist or a humanities scientist or researcher is harder. But whatever floor you walk on in this college, there will be people undertaking research. And it's a core part of any modern university. Now that research process goes on and people explore their data, undertake experiments, reconceptualize theories, and they write those up in what we term outputs, or usually in the biomedical and health sciences, research papers. In the humanities and social sciences, that may be books. But those outputs are quite important to the sort of whole process of academia and academic discourse. They do two things. One, they allow the researcher to articulate what they were trying to do, what data they used, what methods they brought to that data, what they found out, and what you can infer from that data, their conclusions, hopefully leading to some form of recommendation, with that recommendation often being we need to do more research, but at times saying some kind of policy recommendation, we need to change the way we think. The other element of academic papers and books and what have you is that they're in the public domain. So that allows other researchers to read those papers, to validate what's been said, to challenge what's being said, and to critique that. And that process of academic dialogue where you do your research, you publish it, and other scientists can then read it and challenge it, is fundamentally what knowledge is about and what knowledge progression is about. And this is not a small enterprise. Last year, worldwide, over 1.5 million academic papers were published. So, just give that a bit of thought. You cannot keep up with that literature. And importantly, it's not just about academic papers, although, quite often in the circles I now move, we spend a lot of time talking about that. But those academic papers have other outputs. Those outputs are other ideas, so they feed back, and crucially, people. You can't do research without people, so the process of research is also a process of training the next generation of researchers. But those outputs, those papers, and those people in themselves don't have any sort of consequence beyond the academic system. It's capturing that knowledge, it's filling up libraries with that knowledge, the stock of knowledge, but it's not making any difference to my life, it's not making any difference to your lives outside academia. And that's where we get into the space of outcomes. And an outcome occurs when there's a benefit or a consequence of your research beyond the academic system. So to just put some flesh on that, if I'm doing some research and I end up advising a pharmaceutical company, I'm starting that sort of advice as a form of outcome. I may do some research and I may end up, that research may be cited on a white paper, on a government document. I'm starting to have an outcome. My research is having a benefit beyond that academic system. But even if my research is cited on a government document or I'm advising a pharmaceutical company, nothing may happen. It's up to the government to implement my advice. It's up to the company to implement my advice. If something happens, that's when we get into this space of impacts, where we can really see a tangible improvement in society. Simplest way of thinking about that in the sort of medical space is my health has improved. You can measure a health gain because of this research. Now, what I like to do is to broadly and rather crudely simplify this into two systems. One is the academic system, the research system, which is the space to the left-hand side here. And the other system is wider society. That is where research is beginning to make a benefit to the citizens of a country. So let me move on a bit. And in the rest of this lecture, I'm going to do a number of things. I want to begin by describing a study, the first study I undertook when I was at the Wellcome Trust in the space of science policy. And I've chosen that study because in preparing this talk, it dawned on me that the sort of what we did in that piece of work back in 2000 actually has defined a lot of my sort of intellectual curiosity since. And from that, I will identify three enduring themes. I'm going to focus on one of those, probably the most controversial one, which is what is the relationship between basic biomedical sciences and clinical advances. I will then finish off in the last 10 minutes of my talk talking a bit about the implications for the research excellence framework and for assessing research impact. For those of you who don't know what the research excellence framework is, I will come to that when we get to that stage of the talk. So this paper was published in 2000 in the BMJ, and it was a reasonably simple idea at the time. So in the science policy literature, a number of people had looked at patents and looked at what is termed the prior art of patents. So if I file a patent, by law, I have to say what is the existing state of knowledge, so I can prove that my patent is a new idea and I can commercialize that. That prior art sometimes includes academic papers. So science policy people had linked academic papers to patents. So we had this bright idea of doing the same, but linking clinical guidelines to academic papers. So to explain that a bit more, clinical guidelines in their simplest form are a recipe book, if you like, for clinicians explaining how to treat people with different conditions at different points of time. And so the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, many of you have heard of, produces clinical guidelines, and they make recommendations to clinicians within the NHS on what treatments to use in various situations. Now, in theory, those clinical guidelines should be evidence-based, and that means they should be based on the best available evidence, advising the clinicians what to do. And that evidence is captured in those academic papers. So if you pick up a clinical guideline and you start to read it, at the back of it is usually a list of references to academic papers. So by trying to make this linkage between academic papers and clinical guidelines, we're effectively trying to cross that barrier, if you like, between the academic system and the wider society. Now, those academic papers clearly are most important for their content. They explain what you've done, they explain the results you've come across. But for nerds like myself, academic papers have a lot of other information that we can analyze. So if you pick up a paper, it has a date on it. That actually turns out to be very useful. If you look at an academic paper, they are published in journals, and those journals have different characteristics. We can rank journals depending on how many other people read or cite those journals. So we talk about high-impact journals and low-impact journals. But also we can classify journals as whether they contain papers that are based in the basic biomedical sciences or in more clinical applied sciences. So we can analyze the characteristics of journals. The other information we have on academic papers are addresses. So you get the authors of the paper, and then you get the affiliation to those authors. So we can analyze those addresses. We can look at collaboration patterns, how different institutions are collaborating together. We can look at the countries in which the authors are coming from and do other various bits and pieces. And then the other piece of information we also have are references. So just as those clinical guidelines had a bibliography or a list of references at the back, a paper has a list of references. And so we can start to link those references to other papers, and we can build up, as you'll see, these family trees of knowledge, and knowledge generates through time. So we did this work in collaboration with the Healthcare Evaluation Unit at St. George's Hospital, and Peter Littlejohns, who I saw earlier, he's disappeared, he's over there, who's now at King's, but used to be at NICE, headed up that unit at that time. And that unit, this is before the days of NICE, appraised clinical guidelines. They said these are good quality clinical guidelines, so a set of criteria. So we took 15 of these appraised clinical guidelines and stripped out the references from those guidelines, and we had about 2,500 references, and started to analyze the characteristics of those papers using this approach termed as bibliometrics. And we generated a number of findings. We looked at those addresses on those papers, and we found that roughly a quarter, 25% of the addresses on papers cited in clinical guidelines were coming from the UK. Now, this is more than you expect. If you look at all global output for biomedical research and health research, it's around 10%. So what we conclude from that is the authors of UK clinical guidelines are preferentially citing UK papers. Now, this isn't that surprising, because you'd anticipate that a clinical guideline reflects the local context of the health system, and therefore the evidence being used in that clinical guideline is reflective of that system. But the other interesting thing here is that we've done this study a number of times, and we've repeated this observation. Other people have repeated this observation. So there is something about how clinical guidelines are reflective in local evidence. The second thing we did was we looked at the time between the publication of the clinical guideline and the publication of the papers cited on that clinical guideline. And that's where we extracted that data information. And by doing that, we identified that the time was around 8 years. It took roughly 8 years for research to be cited on these clinical guidelines. And again, since we published this piece of work, a number of other people, including themselves, have repeated this type of analysis and come up with very similar figures. I think it's really important to stress what we're measuring here is the time between a publication being cited on a clinical guideline. There's going to be a period of time between getting that research funding, having that input, and publishing that paper. And there's also going to be a period of time between publishing the clinical guideline and what's been recommended in that clinical guideline being put into practice. And when we take all of that sort of what we like to call bench to bedside or input to impact, we come up with an estimate of around 15 to 20 years for the biomedical and health sciences. Lots of people refer to the 17-year figure, but broadly speaking, 15 to 20 years. Now, those of you interested in this topic, last week with colleagues from Health Economics Research Group at Brunel University, the Office of Health Economics, and my previous employer around Europe, we published a paper exploring the issue of time lags, and Steve Hannay and myself had a small piece in Research Fortnight summarizing that work. Now, there's one other piece of analysis coming out of this guidelines work that I want to talk about, but I also, before I do that, want to take another sort of slight educational aside and talk a bit more about language and theory. I want to define what I mean by basic research, and I'm oversimplifying it at this stage. But basic research is largely discovery-driven. It's ideas that have been investigated and sort of initiated, if you like, by the investigator. And it typically takes place in universities. The theory is that you do that basic research, and the ideas and knowledge coming from that basic research, through some process which we really do not understand, ends up in clinical research. And clinical research can be characterized as having an objective. We want to work out whether this medicine works or not. We want to work out whether an intervention works or not. And typically occurs in hospitals and in the private sector, in pharmaceutical companies. And then by some magic process, though that clinical research translates itself into health gain. This is clinical advances. So I have a measurable health gain. My health has improved because of this research. And that health gain can be a range of things. So the easiest way to think about it are drugs and medicines, but it could be medical devices, and probably most importantly, actually, it could be some form of public health or social intervention. Now, this model underpins a lot of today's contemporary science policy. I have a quote here at the bottom from Francis Collins, who's director of the National Institutes of Health in the US. I chose this quote because I didn't want to embarrass any equivalents in the UK, but he said, "Today's basic research is the engine that powers tomorrow's therapeutic discoveries." And that is kind of one of the fundamental principles underpinning a lot of science policy in the biomedical and health space. I've also put 62% up here. This is a study which was done in the mid-1970s, which concluded that 62% of clinical advances were based on basic biomedical research. I put that number there because I want to plant it in your minds now, because I'm going to come back and deconstruct it. So going back to the guidelines study, what we also did was we started to explore that space of how basic research relates to those clinical advances. And you can see the clinical guideline as some form of proxy for a clinical advance. And what we can do is we can build up this research tree, a bit like a family tree, looking at the references on the clinical guidelines, and then looking at the references to those papers cited on the clinical guidelines, and so on. And in this study, we went back 4 generations. Stress this was done in the late 1990s, and we didn't have the IT, so we were actually constrained almost by technology how far we went back, because these grow almost exponentially as you go back. And for each of those generations of papers, we characterized them based on the type of journal in which they were being published. And to do this, we used a system which had been developed by a US company, where they had taken research journals and classified them in 4 levels, and they call these research levels. One of those levels are basic biomedical research journals, and they're 3 differentiating clinical groups. So we did that, and as you can see here, we plotted the proportion of papers, so 30% of the papers cited on a clinical guideline were being published in these clinical observation journals. And as we went down this family tree, as we went down these generations, we see this declining. And that's what you would expect. The deeper you go into that knowledge base, the more basic research you would anticipate. And if we go over here, we see the increase in basic research as you go down that knowledge tree. But the sort of surprising piece in this was not that we got the trends we expected, but only 8% of the research after 4 generations of citations was being cited in basic biomedical journals. So that's sort of challenging, if you like, that 62% number I put up earlier. And that's almost an order of magnitude difference. It's not a small difference. So from that piece of work, I think 3 sort of themes come out, 3 themes that have sort of defined my intellectual journey since. What is the relationship between basic research and clinical advances? How long does it take to translate research from bench to bedside? And how do you really measure the benefits of research? I'm going to focus, as I said earlier, on the first one. What is the relationship between basic research and clinical advances? But at the end of my talk, I'll come back and reflect a bit on the broader impact agenda and REF. But before doing that, I just want to take another aside and make the point that this is an important topic. The science of science may sound nerdy. I would argue it's not. This is a clipping from the Sunday Times a few years back. And in this article, the journalists argue that the UK, and by implication other like countries, can no longer rely on manufacturing to drive economic growth and social well-being. We tried financial services, but that went belly up in 2008. And the last game in town is research. And we need the Boffins to save us. This was published a few years ago, but this is not a new idea.
Neoclassical endogenous growth theory and the symbiotic relationships that people now understand between growth and investment in people and infrastructure.
So any of you recognize that? Go on, who spoke? Who was that? Gordon Brown, yep. He said this in 1992, note the date, 5 years before New Labour came to power, and it was known as his New Economics speech. For those of you, and in that speech, he makes the case for the knowledge-based economy. For those of you who don't understand what he said, like me, you'd be glad to hear that he actually won the Plain English Campaign's Foot and Mouth Award for this particular passage. And Michael Heseltine was alleged to have said at the time, "It's not Brown, it's Bulls," referring to Ed Balls, the now Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. But the important point here is that research is a key government strategy for economic growth. Public and charitable research investments are scarce, especially in times of austerity, and therefore we need to maximize those scarce public and charitable research investments. And to do that, we need to know what works in research. So let me go back to this key theme about the relationship between basic research and clinical advances. A few contextual points. First one is just in 2010, one paper estimated that we spent something like $210 billion on biomedical research. In the UK, around the same time, we spent roughly $1.6 billion. That's excluding pharmaceutical companies. This is taxpayer money and charitable money. And it's quite difficult to work out how that money is allocated. But a piece of work that I was involved with a number of others and was published in The Lancet earlier this year suggests that there's around 70% is spent on the basic biomedical sciences and around 30% on the more applied clinical sciences. You could put a margin of error around that of probably plus or minus 5%, but you're not far off. And as I've already introduced, a lot of the justification for that allocation between the basic and clinical research is this historical idea that 62% of all clinical advances are based on basic biomedical research. But in a series of studies that I was involved in when it ran Europe, and a number of the colleagues who worked with me on those studies are here this evening, started to challenge that idea, that orthodoxy. And I just want to focus in on these 3 studies, which we ended up terming the Retrocyte approach. And what we do in these studies is we take a sample of research projects which were occurring sometime in the past, and we look at those research projects, and through key informant interviews, through bibliometric analysis, by reading the papers, doing archival research in the funders, we build up these case studies, these narratives of how the research translated from bench to bedside. And then we take these case studies, they effectively become our data, and we do 2 things with them. And I should say these case studies are not like ref case studies, for those of you who are thinking that at this stage. These are like 5,000-word detailed documents. They're not the sort of two pages coming out of ref. So we take those documents, those 5,000-word documents, and we do 2 things with them. First thing we do is we convene an independent panel of experts, and we ask them to score those case studies on various impact criteria. And the second thing we do is that we, as the research team, go away and we start tagging information in the case studies which could explain some of the impact. So, for example, was the research undertaken in a clinical setting or in a university? Did the researcher consult with industry? Was the researcher on some form of government advisory panel? And we built up this coding book with a lot of that sort of information. And then what we can do is we can take the scores from that independent panel and relate them to the characteristics described in the research. And in doing so, we can start to try to come up with some factors that are associated with research success or not. In the latest study, which we published in 2013, we focused in on mental health research. We've looked at arthritis research, cardiovascular research, and now mental health research. And we came up with 4 sort of headlines from that work. The first was that the impact, when you followed it in time, was actually very diverse. And this is something we're seeing, and I'll come back to this in a bit, this is something we're seeing in the analysis of the ref case studies. Impact is incredibly broad as a concept, and I think that's important to understand. Secondly, we concluded that people, individuals who span boundaries, in the literature known as the boundary spanners, a term I've always found slightly uncomfortable, but the individuals who span boundaries tend to be associated with greater impact than those individuals who work in silos. And related to that, individuals who are good at championing the ideas are also associated with greater social impact than those people who are not. Now that has a negative consequence because you may be championing poor research, as we saw in the case of the MMR debacle 15 years ago. So we just need to be aware of that. And then the 4th finding is that we found that clinical research had a larger impact on patient care than basic research has over the 20 years since the research has started. So let me just put some numbers on that for those of you who like numbers. In this graph here, on this vertical axis, we have the mean score coming from that independent advisory group. The maximum score they could give was 9. And we have 2 of our 5 impact categories. Knowledge, so that's all about publications of papers and what have you. Future research, generating new ideas for subsequent research proposals. So very much impacts which you would associate with the academic system. And as you can see, there's very little difference between the basic research and the clinical research. But as we move into the wider society space, and we look at policy impacts, we look at the impact on health, and then broader economic impacts, we see that after 20 years, clinical research has a greater impact. Again, challenging that idea that today's basic research is the engine for tomorrow's therapeutic discoveries. Now let's just critique that, because this research is not easy. It's very hard to generate a counterfactual, it's very hard to generate the data. So could we be wrong in coming to this conclusion? Well, one explanation could be time. So in the first study we did on arthritis research, we went back 10 to 15 years. And we were quite rightly critiqued, I think, with the benefit of hindsight, for not going back far enough. The fact that clinical research was having a greater impact than basic research is probably explained by that factor, that issue of time. So we then, in the second study on cardiovascular, went back 15 to 20 years. But we found the same finding, we had sort of dampened down some of our critics, but other people were saying, well, actually, it takes longer than 20 years. So when we had the opportunity to do mental health, we decided let's go back 20 to 25 years. Now, I'd be the first to acknowledge that it may be longer than 25 years. It may take longer for basic research to have an impact than 25 years. But I would argue, if that is the case, let's be explicit about it, because it means that research funding or basic biomedical funding is an intergenerational investment, and we need to see it in that term. I would also suggest that we've probably stretched this methodology to the limit. When we were doing the mental health study, we had trouble in interviewing a number of people. Sometimes they were tired and didn't care, and we tried to persuade them to come out of retirement to speak to us, but they were difficult. And unfortunately, quite a few people had actually died, and there was very little we could do about that. So in one sense, we've sort of stretched, I think, this methodology to its limit. So let's think of it. So with that Retrocyte methodology, what we've done is we've gone back in time and we've sort of traced that knowledge to today and tried to understand what the relationships were. With the clinical guidelines study, which I started off with, we did the opposite. We started off today with a sample of clinical advances as proxied by those guidelines and went backwards trying to understand the antecedent research. I haven't talked about it, but we did another study when at the Wellcome looking at clinical advances in neonatal intensive care using a similar approach, but our endpoint was those clinical advances. And we built up these family trees and tried to understand what the antecedent research looked like. And again, we showed that the contribution of basic research after 4 generations ranged between 2 and 21%, depending on the clinical advance. Now, you may say, well, yeah, you would say that, Jonathan, that's all your research. So my final bit of evidence is this last bullet point, which I had nothing to do, and it's a brilliant piece of work. And what this group had done is they effectively adopted the Retrocyte approach. So they went back 20 years ago, and they took a sample of basic biomedical research journals. They took all the papers out of that sample, 25,000 papers, and they identified papers that purported to claim that there was some kind of clinical relevance to their basic research. And using keyword searches and what have you, they identified about 500 of those papers, and then they sort of read those and got rid of a number of those because their claims were not that strong. And they ended up with 101 papers which claimed that that research had a direct contribution to future therapeutic discoveries and clinical advances. They then jumped forward 20 years to today and worked out whether that promise had come to fruition, whether those promises of 20 years ago had come about. They found that of those 101 papers, which came from 25,000 papers, that only 5 of them had any sort of therapeutic intervention in practice, and only 1 of those 5 was widely used. So I would put it to you, if you synthesize all this information, that in a generous way, around no more than 10% of clinical advances can be traced back to underlying basic biomedical research. And again, that is very different to the 62%. Now let me put up my health warning. This is not me being anti-basic science. I don't actually have a stake in this discussion. I'm not a clinician. I am not a clinical researcher. All I am doing is putting science under the science of science microscope and reporting what I observe when I do that. And this is what scientists do day in and day out. You have a theory, you test that theory against the data, against the empirical knowledge. And I would argue that we need to accept that the adoption of basic research into clinical practice is, at best, extremely rare, and that the formal evidence for the value of basic research is not strong. Now, if I jump from that sort of research conclusion into a policy recommendation, if I was advising a research funder today, and first question I would ask is, at what point do you want to make a difference? Where do you want your impact? At what time do you want your impact to occur? And if it's less than 20 years, my advice would be to focus on the more applied clinical research. And I would also argue that given this, we need to have a serious debate about reallocating some of that funding from the basic pot, which is around 70% of R&D funds, to the more clinical applied pot, which is around 30%. Now, can I just stress, I'm not saying we should not fund basic biomedical research, okay? I would be very comfortable if we got down to 50, 60%. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the current allocation is probably unbalanced, and we need to rebalance that going forward. So on that somewhat controversial note, I will try to move on to a less controversial topic, which is known as REF. David. So what I want to do now is to talk a bit about the Research Excellence Framework. And again, I acknowledge that some of you may be unfamiliar with this, so a couple of slides of introduction. In the UK and elsewhere, the impact of research has been increasingly debated, and this is largely being driven by finance ministries, by the Treasury, who are arguing, are we getting value for money from these investments in research? Through the medical research councils, through National Institute of Health Research. And as a consequence of that sort of political discussion, we've seen both the research councils in the UK and the funding councils in the UK come up with different policies. So if you are applying to the ESRC, the MRC, one of the research councils, as many of you know, you have to write a pathway to impact type statement. And this statement is effectively asking you to think about what strategy you are going to put in place to maximize the impact of this research. And if you do that well, you should be increasing the likelihood of succeeding in that grant application round. The other thing that has occurred is that the funding councils have introduced the assessment of impact, the assessment of impact in their quinquennial review of research excellence in UK universities. Now, this quinquennial review is known as the Research Excellence Framework, or REF, and has occurred roughly every 5 years in the UK since 1986. And as I said, for the first time in 2014, we just finished, obviously, there was an assessment of impact. And universities, such as King's, had to write these impact case studies, explaining how the research, which was located at King's, has had an impact on wider society, how that research has impacted and benefited society in the broadest possible sense. And these case studies, there were 7,000 of them, these case studies were peer-reviewed by panels and got scored, got rated. And the higher the score, the higher the rating, the more money you will get. So you'll be delighted to hear that King's did reasonably well in this process. And we're not talking small amounts of money. So the so-called QR funding, which this help directs, is roughly £1 billion a year going to UK universities. The weight for impact is 20%. So we're talking £200 million a year of research funding is being allocated based on these impact case studies. Now, this is quite interesting because if you start to think about why we undertake research impact assessment, why we evaluate research, one of the reasons is clearly allocation. And I had this slide up 10 years ago, and I had 3 A's on it, and I've had to introduce this 4th A allocation. Thank God I could alliterate with that. The other A, which I think is really important, and I haven't really talked about, is advocacy. Now, historically, when I was at the Wellcome Trust, the leadership would quite often justify and make the case for research based on anecdote. They would cherry-pick good stories and use those for making the case. I would argue that advocacy is really, really important, but that advocacy needs to be bedded in the evidence. And a piece of work which I thought about talking about but decided not to is a series of studies that again involved colleagues from Health Economics Research Group at Brunel, Office of Health Economics around Europe, trying to measure the economic returns of biomedical and health research in the UK. And we came up with an internal rate of return. And if you speak to Sally or David, they will tell you that that number, however false and critiquable that number is, it is very, very valuable in that debate about getting money for science in the UK. Another A is this issue of accountability. As a taxpayer, as an occasional donor to medical research charities, I want to know that we're spending that money wisely. I want to know that research investments are effective and efficient. And I think that's quite important. But as I have illustrated through the debate around the relationship between basic research and clinical advances, you can also analyze. You need to measure research to be able to undertake the analysis. And one of the pleasures I've had over Christmas is reading the 7,000 case studies in collaboration with Digital Humanities Department here at King's and Digital Science. We won the contract in October to do the so-called synthetic analysis of those 7,000 case studies. Now, clearly, you can't read 7,000 case studies, so we've been employing fancy text mining technologies to try to understand what is in those case studies. And this is a word cloud of some of the impacts articulated in those case studies. Now, let me just put some numbers on this. For those of you who are familiar with those REF case studies, there's a section in there called Details of Impact. We have taken all 6.2 million words in that Details of Impact section. And then we've got rid of the stock words, the ands, the ors, the buts. And that generates some 3.4 million words. If we then look for unique words, there's something like 100,000 unique words in that 3.4 million. And if you decide that's too many to look at, let's just look at let's cut off the tail at 10 words. You are down to 20,000 words. And in this graphic, we illustrate the most common 600 of those 20,000 words. And all of you, I can see you, you're all looking at it, you're all looking at words, you're all nodding, you're engaged in this. We're doing far more sophisticated stuff than just generating word clouds, but it's an interesting way of capturing some of that information. So let me come to the end of my talk, last few slides. The whole debate around impact assessment used to be, and I think is going to liven up again. I would argue that it's here to stay. There are people who argue against it. They think it's too expensive. They think it distorts research agendas. They think it's a management fad which challenges academic freedom. That may all be true, but I just really don't see treasuries and people who finance our research moving away from this agenda. I think there will be some kind of debate around the technicalities of REF. We did a piece of work, again, when I was at RAND, for the Higher Education Funding Council, looking at how universities had gone about putting together their impact case studies. And there was lots of complaints around the rules, the guidance documents, but actually there was no consensus in those complaints, which is quite interesting in itself. But I think the real sort of intellectual challenge going forward is some thoughts around the costs and the benefits. Is assessing research impact worth it? And related to that, can we develop impact metrics? Can we find a more quantifiable way of assessing impact? I have to say I'm quite cynical on that last point, but it's a live debate. So to conclude, my sort of take-home messages would be based on sort of 15-odd years of trying to measure research. I would say that it's really important to understand why you're trying to do this. And I think that's where the 4 A's comes in as a useful framework. Is your primary purpose to understand what works in science? Is your primary purpose to allocate research funds? You need to think about that. They're not mutually exclusive, but to understand what's the most important is crucial. I think it's really important to understand that any form of research impact assessment relies on different approaches and different methods. So I've talked to you quite a lot about bibliometrics and case studies, introduce you very briefly to text mining. There's a whole range of methodological tools. Putting research under the microscope is not easy, but actually that's why it's interesting. A lot of the research I presented, you can critique. I'm fully aware of that, and I fully accept it. It's really hard to sort of develop counterfactual arguments. It's really hard to generate really good quality data. But I think we have to be transparent in that as we do it and improve that evidence base. But fundamentally, I would argue that we need a science of science to understand what works. We need a practical evidence base for research policy. And crucially, for universities and for the funders of research, we need to walk the talk. I find it really somewhat ironic that research is about knowledge, it's about discovery and understanding, but we get very nervous when we apply knowledge, discovery, and understanding to the practice of research. So, in short, can the Boffins save us? Yes, they can, but I would argue we need to understand the way we fund and support science better to ensure that is the case. So my final slide is another word cloud. One of the great pleasures of doing research is you get to collaborate with many, many, many people. And this is, I've taken my CV, I've taken the publication list, I've stripped out everybody's surnames and put them up here. I can't acknowledge everybody on this cloud, but I would like to mention Steve Hannay, who's over there, and Martin Buxton, who couldn't be here tonight, both from the Health Economics Research Group at Brunel. I first met Steve and Martin when I was at the Wellcome Trust, and we started collaborating then. Have been partners in crime ever since. But I would just also like to call out Steve Wooding, who's over here. Steve and myself started collaborating at the Wellcome Trust. I think it's rare that there's a project we haven't worked together on. He's got the largest name here. And indeed, I like to jest that I've been collaborating with Steve for longer than I've been married to Lucilla. And I think it's fair to say that Steve and myself do finish each other's sentences at times. So thank you very much.
Well, I think, Jonathan, you can hear from that an appreciation of your work. I was wondering how far we went back, and I think it's about 17 years. You were the executive assistant at the Wellcome Trust to Mike Dexter. And the first piece of work that you did working with us was benchmarking research outputs in the NHS, and you came to present the work to our R&D committee at the region. And after you'd done it, the chair, who was a rather important businessman, said to me, "That's a young man to watch. He's going to change the world." And I think you've given us some of the evidence of that very nicely. I hadn't realised until this evening that you'd had a big interest in health before, and the ICNARC, the intensive care audit, and everything was there. I've been fascinated about our shared interest in women and women in science, and I find that you started working on that actually back in 1997 you published. So this is a long-term interest, and thank you, because that's about data, it's about fairness. And of course, your bibliometrics work started in 98. So I thought I needed, as everyone will have seen, you work with frameworks, a kind of framework for responding to what you've said. And I was thinking how, and I quote, "The planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this: most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time." I wonder how many will know this. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movement of small green pieces of paper, which was odd, because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And I think what you've been doing is moving out the small green pieces of paper and really trying to give us a structure and take it forwards. And I could cite the payback work you did, the research on research. I too have watched Steve Wooding, Martin Buxton, Steve Hannay, and others work with you to great help. I want to put on record our thanks for all the work that you and colleagues have done, helping us work through the National Institute of Health Research, help us think through how we should allocate the money so that we would learn it properly. And I think you really have put research on the map. And actually, I think, to go back to the text that I'm using, One of the things that Ford Prefect had always found hardest to understand about humans was their habit of continually stating and repeating the very, very obvious. What you did was, like Ford Prefect, you challenged the very, very obvious, which was basic research should get all the money because it's going to solve all the problems. I still think it's important, but it's not going to solve all our problems. You asked, what do we do? Why do we do it? How can we do it best? And you helped us through all of those questions. And I want you to remember from our text of the evening that the answer to the great question of life, the universe, and everything is 42. According to Deep Thought, who said it was infinite majesty and calm. But Jonathan gave us that magic number, and he told it to us this evening. It's 17 years. So I'll leave the text behind, but I do want to say how much you have influenced policy in research and how we all practice our funding, and that has benefited the public. And I don't suppose most people recognise the debt that they owe you, but intellectually I absolutely do. So I want to thank you for a tour de force talk, but actually particularly for the work, your lifetime's work. I know it isn't over, so I think I'll finish by saying so long and thanks for all the fish.
Thank you.